So let's get started. I have up on our screen the year of the Spirea. So this is our webinar, Ask the Experts about Spirea. And I am Diane Blazek. I'm the Executive Director for National Garden Bureau and All America Selections. And I have with me Gail Pabst, who is going to be providing a lot of cool links for you. So our panelists are Natalie from Spring Meadow Proven Winner Shrubs. We have Debbie Lonnie from Bailey Nursery First Edition, and we have Georgia Clay from Monrovia Nurseries. And it's very interesting that we have people located all over because Georgia is on the West Coast, Natalie, you're right in the middle, and Debbie, you're on the East Coast. And then between your companies, you have trialing locations all over. So I think we have a very good representation from our panelists, so they can hopefully answer all the questions that come forth. First, I know there's several different types of Spirea. You know, it is the year of the Spirea here for National Garden Bureau. And so let's just open it up to our panelists. I think we have, I don't know, 6 or so main types of Spirea. So who wants to jump in and talk about 1 or 2, and then we'll turn it over to somebody else to talk about a few.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll start first because I don't have as much experience as Debbie has. So I really want to talk about Spirea japonica because it's really the broadest category that we sell. Our double play series is mostly comprised of Spirea japonica. It's a really easy to, it's a nice, easy to grow plant. It's super hardy, very floriferous. And the great thing about Spirea japonica is it has that broad color range of foliage. So we get this nice bright spring foliage, a good summer color, and then another color in the fall. And it's great for breeding with as well. So it's a great type of a species to breed other types of Spirea with and kind of extend that color story a little bit, or add a flower that you like from another kind, which I'll talk about when I talk about one of our Spireas in the presentation. But I think it's also probably the one you're going to see most often in garden centers.
So maybe the most common. We asked that question the other day in our hydrangea webinar, is which one do you think is most common? So yeah, anybody else? You want to talk about some other types of Spirea?
Yeah, I'll chime in about, there's a Bridal Wreath Spirea. And so some of you may be familiar with the cut flower industry, and Bridal Wreath Spirea is one of those that you might see there. It's sort of a more old-fashioned plant. It has those, double white flowers that kind of cover the bare branches, and quite arching as well. And it gets a little larger. So that's something that you may be familiar with also, if not the landscape variety. Bridal wreath in flower arrangement is very popular also.
And I will also say this is just a weird and vivid memory for me, is when I was in grade school, we had a bunch of the bridal wreath around the base of this big old brick building. They made great hiding spots if you're playing hide and seek, because they just, like you say, they drape over and you could crawl right in there if you're a little elementary kid. So thanks for bringing up that memory for me. Debbie, which ones would you like to talk about? Or do you want to take all the remaining ones?
Oh, sure, I can. So we have Spirea bumalda, which is really close to the Japanese Spirea that Natalie talked about, and a couple fairly unknown species, birch leaf Spirea, Spirea betulifolia, and Korean Spirea, Spirea fritiana. But they're very useful in the right spot and are starting to be used by breeders more. And there's some very nice varieties within those species. So worth looking at when you're looking at the tags in the garden center.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, this is a service that I want to ask on behalf of our attendees today and anybody watching this, because it is a question we get often, very often, especially when we're talking about perennials or shrubs. But are any of the Spirea considered invasive in any states?
I can go. Spirea, the USDA does note that a lot of especially the Japanese Spirea is on an invasive list as a plant to watch. So while they've been monitoring it in certain areas and it can have the capacity to reseed, it is a plant to watch still right now. And that's true, I think, of a lot of plants. What might be invasive in your area isn't necessarily invasive in another area. Like out on the West Coast, they have a lot of trouble growing butterfly bushes that aren't sterile. Here in Michigan, we don't have any trouble with butterfly bushes reseeding. Now, hibiscus, that's another story. Rose of Sharon, another story altogether. But it just depends really on your area on what might be considered invasive. So rather than taking a whole group of Spirea or a whole category of plants and saying, well, that's an invasive plant, it's good to look in your area and decide and find out, is it invasive where I am? And then, of course, Spirea also is such a wide category. There are native Spirea that are less invasive than the Asian versions.
And I would just like to just to echo that. And if you ever are curious about what's invasive in your area, one, the garden centers are great resources for you. And just know that if you find anything that a nursery like Bailey's or Spring Meadow or Monrovia is going to ship into your area, we'll never ship you anything that's invasive in your area. So if you see it in the garden center, you can rest assured that that you're going to be just fine.
Right. So we're actually not allowed to ship them.
Yeah, exactly. So another reason to shop locally, you know, don't drive 5 states away to buy a shrub because you never know for your area. But I think that is fabulous information. And actually, Gail can put a link. We put a notice like on the front page of our website because we were getting this question so often. And there's a link there where you can literally go and look by your state and see which things are listed as invasive or ones to watch, that kind of thing. So thank you. I think that's a very educational topic. Debbie, did you have anything else to add before we move on?
No, I think they explained it perfectly.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pull the poll down. Let's hear. If I end it, I can share the results. So a big majority of you, almost 60%, do have Spirea. So I'm sure you know quite a bit, but this is your chance to learn even more. 11% do not have one. 31% said, no, I don't have a Spirea in my yard, but I want to add one. So that leads us to our presentation where we are going to share with you some of the different varieties of Spirea from our panelists. So you can make your notes and write down some of your favorites, but also, you know, we will send this recording out at a later date, and you can go to our website to the Year of the Spirea. Gail had already put that link there. So let's see here. Let's start with this Monrovia variety. Georgia, we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so Butterscotch Baby, this is one of my favorite new plants we introduced for 2023. It is amazing. It has this intense caramel butterscotch color in the spring and the fall, and it stays super compact. So, you know, Spirea is generally about 3 feet tall. This one's about 1.5 feet tall max, and it stays this really nice, almost a mushroom cap shape. It's quite beautiful, and the intensity of the color, it's hard to even describe. It is so intense. You know, it's not common for me to have visitors to the nursery or to the trial garden who stop in amazement over a Spirea. But I will say that the amount of people who saw this from across the field and excitedly asked me, like, what is that plant? You know that you have a winner when that happens.
Great. And, you know, one of the things I forgot to ask is about zone hardiness. So I'm assuming Spirea kind of have a range, maybe 4 to 9 or something. Is that about right? Okay. So let's assume that everything is zone hardy 4 through 9, but each one of you can comment if it's different on your specific varieties. So as we go through there, I know a lot of people want to know that. Okay, it looks like we have a series now from you, Natalie. There's a double play series with multiple varieties in there.
Yeah, and before we start, I just want to make a quick note on the hardiness, because not everybody understands that when you look at the hardiness zone on your plant tag, what that is showing you, for instance, I'm going to talk about this double play Big Bang. It says a hardiness of zone 4 through 8. That is a cold tolerance. So we're not talking about the heat tolerance. The AH used to have a heat tolerance scale. So we're talking about what is the cold tolerance of that plant. So it's an important thing to remember that that's not measuring heat at all, just cold. So
thank you. Thank you. Good tip.
Yes. So this is double play Big Bang Spirea. I already talked about the fact that I want to talk about Spirea japonica a little bit, and this is one of them. The reason I love Spirea japonica is it's hardy, it's adaptable, and it has this really wide range of foliage and flower colors. And I talked about before that it has this ability that you can cross it with other species and give you even a wider range of breeding possibilities. So this plant and quite a few of our Spirea at Spring Meadow were bred in-house by Tim Wood. And he's bred so many of our successful cultivars. And what he observed when he was breeding early on was most Spirea are sold in the early spring. And for a lot of the old conventional Spirea, that was well before the flowers appeared, and they didn't necessarily have beautiful foliage at that time too. So, you know, when people judge what that plant looks like in the container when they go to the garden center in the spring. So what he did was he started looking for other kinds of Spirea, like a Spirea frichiana, which at the time was called pink parasols, which was known for attractive foliage. And he crossed it with a yellow leaf Spirea japonica variety. And that's how he came up with this hybrid, eventually came up with this hybrid double play Big Bang. So this particular Spirea is hardy in zones 4 through 8. It flushes vibrant orange, and then when it matures, it turns a bright yellow, and then it kind of has this contrasting red growth, which you can see on the screen. This is a nice compact Spirea. It's going to be 2 to 3 feet tall and wide with really, really large pink fluffy flowers. And it gets this trait of these large fluffy flowers from that old pink parasol Spirea frichiana. So this cultivar, interestingly enough, was named in honor of Tim's wife. So if you look at the cultivar name, it's called Tracy, and it's proven itself to be a first-class garden landscape plant. And Tim even says himself, thank goodness for that, because you don't want to name a bad plant after your wife.
Oh, that's a great story. Okay, so going along in the double play series, the next one, Blue Kazoo.
This is double play Blue Kazoo, a member of our 12-part double play series. Unlike a lot of the others in our series, this is not a Spirea japonica. This is a selection of a Spirea media. So this is a species that's native to Eastern Europe. So it's a low-mounded 2 to 3 foot plant, and it has this waxy blue-green foliage that almost looks like it's airbrushed with a cast of purple in the hues. And then it has large white spring blooms that really contrast nicely with that foliage. So you can spring this, you can trim this to shape in early spring. And that's when you deadhead that, because it blooms on new growth, you're going to get repeat flowering later in the year. So that's what I really love about that plant, is it has that gorgeous kind of blue foliage, really graceful and elegant, hardy in USDA zone 3 to 8. Okay. All right, looks like we've got the next slide.
And candy corn.
All right. This is double play candy corn. And as was mentioned earlier, this is also one that really turns heads right now in our gardens at Spring Meadow. It is blasting with color. So this is actually bred by Tom Ranney out of NC State. And this is a triploid hybrid. And it was selected for its colorful foliage, and which emerges a fiery, like candy apple red color. So that's already happened here in Michigan. And then it turns to that orange color that you see on the left-hand side of your slide. In the middle of the summer, it's going to change to bright yellow and then a butter yellow, and it's going to have bright purple flowers. This is a nice small variety as well. It's only going to be 1.5 to 2.5 feet round. So it's a very rounded plant, very versatile in the landscape and garden. This is one that you really want to grow if what you want is a pop of color that's going to be ever changing over the season. The flowers are nice, but we really, really push this one for its extraordinary foliage. Now, this can be planted in part shade or in well-drained soil. But for this one, you want to avoid really dry conditions. The foliage can turn brown at the edges if it's in a really dry area. So kind of give it a little more regular irrigation than you would with a regular spirea, which are actually quite drought tolerant when they're established. A good rule of thumb for the shrub, and most shrubs really, is the more sun a plant gets, the more water it's going to need, especially if you're in a warmer climate.
And I do have a question. Why the name Double Play for all these?
I think it's just because, you know, the spirea are rebloomers, right? So you can get your double blooms. They'll bloom in the spring, and for most of them, you shear them off because they bloom on new wood, not all, but a lot of these japonicas, they'll bloom on new wood, so you can shear them and get a fresh crop of new flowers, double the flowers in your spring.
Excellent. Okay, let's hear about doozy.
So having said that, thank you for the perfect lead in, Diane. Double play doozy actually doesn't need to be sheared to rebloom. So this is also a Tom Ranney plant, and it's also a triploid, just like candy corn. But unlike candy corn, this one is bred for its reblooming ability. It's a seedless spirea. So yes, that also makes it non-invasive in an area where that might come up as a problem. But what it really does that's interesting is it blooms, and then because the plant is seedless, it doesn't know to stop blooming. So it just keeps pushing new blooms right up through those old seed heads. So that gives it, you know, this reblooming ability without really a lot of maintenance. So that's the great thing about double play doozy. It has green foliage. The new growth is like a red color on the tips, and it's just a really, really gorgeous reblooming seedless variety.
Great colors. Okay. And then, so there's a red.
Oh my goodness. Double play red. Okay. Double play red has kind of cherry red spring foliage, but it was primarily selected for its blooms. So these have it's kind of the darkest red flowers we've seen, these sangria red flowers, which come late, and you'll see them in late spring to early summer. And if you look really closely at that image on the right, you're going to see that each floret is crowned with this spray of long anthers that give it kind of a purple pollen, and it gives it that kind of water beaded effect for a really interesting flower. In the spring, like I said, you're going to get glowing red foliage, and throughout the season, we're going to have that green foliage tipped in burgundy. This is a 3 to 8, just like double play doozy, which I didn't mention. It's also 2 to 3 feet tall and wide, so a great garden-friendly size spirea.
Thank you very much. Now we have 3 here from another one of our members who unfortunately could not be on as a panelist today. These are from Star Roses, and it's the Empire series. And these 2 are known for being very compact. And the Empire comes in Ice Dragon, Northern Lights, and Yeti. And Georgia, I think you had some things to share about Yeti because you have it in the Monrovia program as well.
We do. Yeah. I personally really love Yeti. I think, you know, we focus on those bright colors for flowers in the garden, the pinks and the purples. And I think this white is such a welcome addition. I really love its true white. They self-clean. So again, as Natalie was saying, no need to do any maintenance in order to get that rebloom. They're going to self-clean. And they're really cold hardy. So I think these are zones 3, and they will, like I mentioned, they rebloom as well. So Yeti's a really nice variety, as are the other 2.
Okay, thank you. Now, Debbie, we're going to head over to, I did put the Bailey logo on, but this really is a first editions, I believe.
Yes, all the spirea that we have are in our first editions program. This is a nice plant that was discovered by a great nurseryman up in Canada. And this is basically a bridal wreath type of spirea, but with chartreuse foliage. It's called fire gold. It gets big, and as you can see by that picture on the right, has a very nice upright to arching habit, blooms in the spring, has beautiful chartreuse foliage that does not burn in full sun. As a matter of fact, if you put this plant in shade, it will turn a little bit more lime green. So I think of all the plants we've shown so far, this is really our first spring blooming spirea. You can categorize spirea as spring bloomers and summer bloomers. And the bridal wreath are the great spring bloomers. You prune them after they are done blooming. So this is a wonderful white flower that I love white and yellow as a combination in the garden. And it really makes a nice display. You could make this into an informal hedge or put it at the back of the garden. Lovely variety.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to toss it back to you, Natalie.
Okay, what we've got here is Glow Girl Spirea. This is a Spirea betuifolia. It's an award-winning birch leaf spirea with white spring flowers and that golden foliage that turns red in the fall. This is a gold leaf sport of Tor. It's 3 to 4 feet. It's a 3 to 4 foot rounded plant with lemon orange foliage, and that's going to give you that bright pop of color all season long with that gorgeous white flower. I absolutely agree. A white flower is spectacular mixed into a garden. This is going to have reddish spring flower buds that open to those pure white flowers. And in fall, the leaves are going to turn a rich burgundy color. So once again, one of the things I love about spirea is that ever-changing foliage. You get that great fall color. This is a bright yellow foliage, but it's not going to burn in the summer like a lot of bright yellow will. So you can put it right out there in the full sun and not worry about that. It's a low maintenance plant, outstanding cold hardiness, all the way down to zone 3. So for those of you people that are in those cold zones, all my friends up there in Minnesota that I just saw, this is a great plant for you. Birch leaf spirea is actually, it's native. I had a little discussion around here because I was like, native, I thought this was native I thought this was native to Asia, but it's actually native in 3 continents, including the United States. Now, when we say native, it's also important to remember when we say something's a native species, it has been bred with another native species, and it doesn't mean it's native to your area. So a lot of things are very regionally native. Betuifolia happens to be more native in the upper West Coast than in the area where I am now, but that doesn't mean that the insects that would feed up there aren't feeding here too on it and aren't enjoying it and pollinating it in the same way it would if it were actually born out of, Michigan soil. And I wanted to talk about one other plant super briefly, double play dolly. It's a brand new plant that's coming out next season. I'm surprising Diane with this. I didn't put it in the program, but it's the newest of our double play series. I didn't ask her to put it in because you're not going to find it at garden centers this year, but it has that same bright chartreuse foliage, a red flower, part of the double play series. So you can look for that next year. And that's a Spirea japonica as well.
And all you have to do is come back to the National Garden Bureau website like late this fall, winter, and we will have our new plants, new varieties program launched for 2024. And I'm sure Natalie will put that plant in for next year. So just remember to go back to National Garden Bureau, ngb.org, like around December, January, you'll be able to see it. Okay, so next we're going back to Georgia with a little flirtatiousness here, it looks like.
Yes, little flirt. This is one of the very best performers in the garden. It has a beautiful burgundy new growth in the spring, and then followed by, as you can see, that really nice deep pink flower. It's going to bloom towards the end of spring and then all the way through the fall. And it consistently puts on at least 3 flushes of flowers, even for those in northern climate. So that's excellent rebloom on this. Fantastic flowering, really nice, tight, refined habit. It really always looks good. When we walk the breeder fields and see people who are breeding Spirea, I almost always see little flirt planted in their garden as the sort of the gold standard of what they're sort of looking for. So a really excellent variety. It's going to be about 2.5 to 3 feet wide.
And a quick question here, and any of the panelists can jump in. What about deer resistance with Spirea? And I know the answer is always, well, if the deer are hungry, they're going to eat anything. But let's just talk generalities.
I'll speak to that. That's right. Deer don't read books, so they don't look at the lists of deer-resistant plants. But Spirea, they may take a nibble or two, but rarely are Spirea severely damaged by deer. So I don't know if you can call that resistant, but they're not going to take down to the ground like they will other plants.
Great, thank you.
My last house had a salad bar in the front yard, and the deer completely ignored the Spirea. So, you know, if my deer didn't, you know, they would eat a lot of things. Rutgers University has a nice chart for deer resistance that people can look up, and it will tell you what it, you know, what kind of plants, if they're rarely, seldom, or, you know, often damaged by deer.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, Georgia, you get to continue.
Okay, so I'm going to continue with Little Sizzle, which is sort of the Little Flirt's counterpart. These are going to be about the same size, so that 2.5 feet, 3 feet tall and wide. But this time it has bright orange foliage in the spring, and then it ages to that, as you can see in the photo, that beautiful yellow chartreuse color. You'll notice a theme with all these panelists saying that the yellow foliage won't burn in the sun. That was a big complaint for yellow foliage in the garden for a long time. Still is, but breeding now has come a long way for sun tolerance. So you can plant these beautiful lime foliage plants and really not have to worry about all that scorch.
Thank you. And Debbie, instead of little, you have little.
Yes, well, and the theme is chartreuse foliage here. This is Little Spark, which was developed by a breeder in France. It's a nice compact variety, a summer blooming variety. When it emerges in the spring, the growth is a really fun shade of orange, which looks great against the chartreuse on the slightly older foliage. It only gets about 18 to 24 inches tall and just a little bit wider. And small plants are great for people's maybe townhouse gardens, smaller landscapes, foundations where you don't want monstrous plants. And I think you've seen that in everybody's varieties here, is that Spirea are tightening up. They're nice and full, they're smaller. You don't have to prune the heck out of them to keep them in shape. And this one is just a nice small mounded plant.
Great, thank you. And stay there, you've got Pink Sparkler.
Pink Sparkler, another variety developed by a different breeder in France. And actually this is one of the birch leaf species, and it has really good season-long interest. When the new growth comes on, there's some nice reddish tones to it. And it has a beautiful pink flower through the season. But to me, the nicest attribute of this plant is the fall color. It turns this incredible shade of burgundy when the cool comes on later in the summer and fall. You start to get those burgundy tones come on. It lasts for a good long time. And I just think it looks great. So it's not a big plant, 3 to 4 foot tall, 3 to 4 foot wide. Forms a nice mound, easy to maintain, loves full sun, takes a little bit of shade. What's not to like?
Excellent, thank you. This next variety is called Pop Rocks Petite, again with this theme of being a petite. You see a beautiful bee there on one of the blooms. And at this point, I wanted to mention some of the brands that you're going to see at retail. And I think you've seen them from some of the logos that I've had on the slides. So this is Bloomin' Easy. This is from a grower that's located in Canada that does ship around. Debbie, we were talking about, my apologies. I put bay daily on these slides, but really it's to be first edition. So that's the brand you would see on the pots at retail. And then the other two logos are Monrovia and Proven Winners Color Choice. Those are the ones you'll see. And then we had the Empire series from Star Roses, and the brand that you would see on that is Bloomables. So we have, I think, 5 brands here for you to look at or look for when you're going to your local garden center. And then, okay, here's this one that I hid under as a kid. So you can just see how beautiful and arching it is. And I'm guessing, does anybody know, probably about 6 feet tall in most climates?
Yes, this plant actually came from Bailey Nurseries a lot of years ago before I started working there. It was discovered in the field. We look for spores and mutations, and this is basically an improved Bridal Wreath Spirea. Just a little shorter and tighter, but you can see it still has that arching habit. You know, this is the one we all remember from our grandmother's yard. But the reason Renaissance was chosen is because it is very disease resistant. It doesn't get any of the leaf spot diseases that you see sometimes on the old Bridal Wreath Spirea. So if you love this old-fashioned look, you really should look for Renaissance.
Thank you. Okay. Now the next one, Debbie, here for you is Spot On.
This is a fun plant from breeder Mike Yanni from Wisconsin, and it is Betulifolia type. This picture on the left is actually 2 plants growing together in our trial block. It's the same species as a variety called Tor, which we have found has been used quite extensively by landscapers and contractors because it's so easy to grow. It doesn't need a lot of maintenance. It doesn't need a lot of pruning. Tor is a white flowered form. This is a pink flowered form. And what's really interesting about it is it does bloom just once in June. When it's done blooming, you'll start to notice there are some red spots on the foliage. They're very irregular. There's not a disease. We've had it all tested. As a matter of fact, my friend Mike, who bred this, he wanted to name it Dracula's Drippings. And I told him, no, Mike, you cannot name a plant that. So he came up with the name Spot On, which is far more appropriate. And it's just a great plant, tolerates full sun, hot blue blaring sun, but a little bit of shade as well. So great, easy to grow plant. It's being used up here in the upper Midwest quite a bit.
Thank you. Okay, Sundrop.
Oh, Sundrop was discovered many years ago by our inventory manager as a sport in the Bearwood field. A really nice chartreuse plant, a small plant. Sundrop no more than a foot and a half tall and just a hair wider. So great for small spaces. A summer blooming spirea with those pink flowers. It will rebloom if you do a little bit of deadheading on it, but it's very easy to grow and is great in small spaces.
Thank you. Okay, Georgia, now we've got Plumtastic.
Yeah, Plumtastic. This is one of my favorite spireas. And for me, it's about the foliage. The foliage is this gorgeous plum color. It's super glossy. And when it comes out in the spring, it's super fresh looking. You know, that foliage, you see it and it's like, looks like it just took a nice shower and somebody sprayed it with Pledge or something. I don't know, super glossy, really nice. And it'll continually flush that plum color all season long. So you get that really beautiful, deep, dark, dramatic foliage. And then you also have that pink, almost red flower, you know, summer through fall. So it's a really great plant. It's going to be about 3 feet tall by 3 feet wide. I did see there was a question in the chat about Spirea in containers, and yes, they make great container plants, especially when we're going through these ones that are more compact now. Perfect for putting in a container, as long as you don't overwater in a container. They don't like wet feet. Everything else should be just great.
And I have a follow-up question on that, because we had, and I can't remember which webinar it was, but there were some recommendations from our panelists that if you want to overwinter a small shrub, then you should assume either 1 or 2 zones warmer. You want to explain that, Georgia?
Yeah. So think about what your soil is doing to the roots when you're planted in the ground. The ground is a really great insulator. And so if you're bringing those roots above ground and they're in a pot, if you're a zone 6 normally, you'd want to think about looking at maybe zone 4 plants. So that you really make sure that they're going to overwinter just fine with that more exposure that you would have in the pot.
Excellent. Yes, I couldn't remember if it was 1 or 2 zones, so that's good. Since we're still on Plumtastic, how well would it do in zone 8A?
It should do just great. I live in zone 8 and we have a wonderful Plumtastic in our landscape. And it's done really, really great.
Okay, so we have one more variety, and then we're going to get to our general questions, which are all about sun, shade, soil, etc. So Debbie, I think you get to do the last one on this superstar.
Superstar. Been around a little while. One of our first editions plants from a Canadian breeder. This one is known for really bright red, new growth when it's emerging in the spring. It is a plant that gets 2 to 3 foot tall, 2 to 3 foot wide, a summer bloomer. You can see kind of a pink to almost purpley red color on it, but will continuously bloom throughout the summer. I had one in my backyard and I would always deadhead it a little bit when it was done. And then I would get a great flush of flowers later in the season on it. With some nice fall color as well. So a good compact plant for landscapes.
Great. Okay, so that finishes our presentation. I'm going to go back to the beginning, so hope I don't make anybody dizzy. But let's talk about sun versus shade. Are there any varieties that have been bred for the shade, or how much sun do they need? Do they want afternoon sun, morning sun? How about our panelists jump in on that topic?
Well, I think Spirea, they have a real wide tolerance of sun. Full sun, most all varieties tolerate full sun. And to me, full sun is 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight a day. But they also tolerate some shade, some middle of the road shade. Don't put them in your deepest, darkest corner underneath a pine tree or spruce tree where it's just pitch dark. They're not going to perform there. And we've shown you a lot of colorful plants today. All of us have. And really, some sun brings out those tones and you really get the best tones in the sun. But I consider it a pretty versatile genus of plants.
Any other comments from our other panelists about sun versus shade and any other specific varieties to mention?
I think Debbie hit it on the head.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, look at that. Okay, who wants to tackle the question about fertilization and pruning times? I heard some of you say blooms on new wood, some on old wood. When do you trim them back? When do you prune them, fertilize them? All kind of one question, a whammy question.
I'll talk about pruning quickly because it's important to not, people ask a question about pruning, but then it's so regional, right? Where one person's going to prune is going to be at a completely different time of year than when another person wants to prune. And some varieties don't need to be pruned at all. I think Debbie talked about a variety that is, or maybe it was Georgia, talked about a variety that is reblooming. We have a variety that's reblooming. But generally, after the flowers have gotten tired with a spirea, you can prune them and get a reflush. My first experience with a spirea, I used to work at an intermediate school district building, and I had a window by my desk, and there were spirea outside the window, and the grounds crew would prune them 3 times a summer, and they would flower and flower and flower and flower. So the longer your season, the more flowers you'll get, right? It is a deciduous plant. So at the end of the season, it's going to stop flowering for you. The sun is going to make a difference on how often and how long it flowers. So I think for pruning, the important thing to do is ask your garden center, so you get really exact regional advice. It's hard to hurt a spirea, though, by pruning.
Yeah, I was just going to add that they are fast growers. And like you mentioned, Natalie, with the pruning crew 3 times a summer, they really do recover really quickly and take well to a shaping or a prune. So don't feel afraid to take them and cut them back a little.
And somebody is asking, how far back do you prune them to get a refresh on flowers?
I'd just shape it.
Well, summer flowering types can be pruned dormant before they start to grow in the spring, down to 6 to 8 inches. But the bridal wreath types, I prefer to prune after they flower. And because they can become 6 to 8 foot tall shrubs, you just don't give them a haircut. What you do is you go into the base of the plant, take out the largest branches, just 2 or 3 at a time, and that promotes new young growth from the base. And that's the better way to prune the taller types.
Okay. Do spireas have thorns?
No.
No.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, exactly. Because I would have gotten a little scratched up when I was crawling under them. Are you seeing any issues with golden leaf varieties having dieback? She says, help. Are the golden leaf varieties not as hardy? Lorraine, can you tell us which zone you're in? But it's okay, zone 5B.
I find that a lot of times with golden foliage shrubs, they often don't grow quite as vigorously. I also find that with dieback, if plants are being, I don't know, I didn't read the chat, but if plants are being, if they have some wet feet, they can also have some dieback. But generally, you know, I would recommend some of these newer gold foliage varieties you might have some better luck with.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's talk about the soil. We talked about the shade versus sun. What kind of soil is best? I think you had mentioned they don't like wet feet, so obviously well drained. Anything else there on where to plant them and what to plant them in?
Well, I can jump in again. They're really not picky. So like you mentioned, they don't like wet feet, but they're really going to tolerate most any soil. So whether that's sandy soil, clay soil, they are totally fine, which is why we love them in the landscape because they're relatively drought tolerant and they are really not picky at all.
Yeah, they're very adaptable.
Very adaptable. Awesome. Awesome. Let's talk about pollinators. What pollinators do they attract? That's always a good thing.
Bees.
Bees and butterflies and
yep.
Just kind of great magnets.
People don't think about houseflies are also pollinators. A lot of times people will say, oh, there's houseflies on my hydrangea or houseflies on my spirea. Well, they're a pollinator too. So anything that has pollen is going to attract things that will move pollen around and that like to, you know, sip on that pollen.
I always see a lot of bumblebees on my spirea. So bumblebees really like spireas have that flat flower, which acts as sort of a landing pad. And so those larger bumblebees really can get in there. And that's what I always see on my spireas and one of the reasons why I love them so much.
Yeah. Now I've never seen like a hummingbird on them. And maybe it's because the flowers that are always near the spirea, they like those trumpet shaped flowers. But they certainly are the right color.
Absolutely. And you brought up something, Natalie. What about what plants look good with them? You know, what would you say if you've got a little compact one or if you have the tall one? What are some perennials or other shrubs that you might plant with them? What makes a really good combination?
I mean, if I were going to plant a companion plant, and I often recommend Spirea as a companion plant to other things because it has such a wide color story, is I always try to choose, rather than a specific kind of plant, is if you're going to choose a Spirea, say with a gold leaf, and a red flower, maybe I'm going to plant that next to something that has a dark purple leaf or a dark green leaf with a white flower. So just basically trying to choose something that's going to contrast with that color, and maybe something that has a different bloom time as well. So you can extend the season of your whole garden by, if I'm going to plant my white hydrangea next to my gold leaf spirea, that's really great because I'm going to get that early spring bloom in my spirea. Then if it's a little like a miniature panicle hydrangea, I'm going to get that midsummer bloom on my panicle hydrangea. And then I can keep shearing my spirea to finish out that season. And of course, the foliage is really going to complete that season as well.
Georgia, what about some of your favorite combinations?
Yeah, I think it's fun to think about this idea of contrast in color and bloom time, but also in texture. So if you think about, like, we mentioned that the bumblebees really like the flat flower of the spirea. So I always like to think, okay, if you've got that flat flower, then if you can add maybe an upright or a spiky flower, so maybe a salvia or a perovskia or something like that could really be sort of interesting. And then also in foliage too. So spireas have that more fine texture. So maybe adding in something with a little bit coarser, larger leaf would also be something really interesting. But spireas are pretty versatile. So the list is endless of what you can, as Natalie alluded to, what you can pair with a spirea.
Great, thank you. One of the questions I forgot to ask earlier is, what is a false spirea?
We actually have a false spirea in our catalog called Mr. Mustard, and I know that Debbie has one as well. And it's a sorbaria, and it has a kind of that same kind of fine textured leaf, a very colorful leaf that that will be changing through as it matures, and it has that spire kind of flower that Georgia was talking about, that Astilbe type tall spiky flower. So ours is Mr. Mustard. And I know that Bailey's, I was just at one of their presentations, and I think you have a new one as well.
Yes, we have one. I hope you can hear me. I'm having internet issues, so my apologies. We have one called Matcha Ball. Both Spirea and Spirea are in the same family, in the Rosaceae family, so they are somewhat related. But there's a whole trick right behind common names. This is why I use Latin a lot, because sometimes common names can trip us up. And so a false spirea is not in the genus Spirea at all. Still a good plant, I think.
So we'll have to have a different webinar on that.
Right, like your grandma might call there Astilbe a false spirea. That is the problem with common names, is regionally, you know, things can be called all kinds of different things.
Exactly, yeah. So let's talk about, are there any common diseases that a spirea might get? Now, I know that that is something everybody is working on when you're doing your selections and breeding, is you want to make sure that there's more resistance to some of these common diseases. But what are some of the common ones? How do you treat them? Or do you just buy the newer spirea that are disease resistant?
You can get a little bit of powdery mildew. Oh, sorry, Georgia. You go ahead, Georgia.
Oh, no,
you probably
Debbie,
have a better internet than.
Well, I was just going to say exactly what Debbie was going to say. Powdery mildew can be some issues in spirea, as well as they can get a leaf spot. You know, they're in the Rosaceae family, so they can get a lot of the same pests and diseases as other members of that family. Most aren't all that serious, but, you know, for powdery mildew, planting in full sun is going to be really helpful, making sure it gets quite dry, keeping things air flowing through your plant, also being sure you're clearing away your debris at the end of the season and during all the fallen leaves, clearing that up so you don't have a lot of host material left.
Okay, so to all of our attendees, if you have any other questions, please post them in the chat. to our panelists, are there any other closing thoughts from any of you, all of you, on Spirea, why you love Spirea, best uses, any other thing like that, so that we can get all the people who said they don't have a Spirea? What is your inspirational tip on getting them to go out and get a Spirea for their yard?
Well, I love Spirea so much that I recently made a whole video about it. So this is where you'll find it, and it's backwards probably for you, but it's a bit.ly link. It's a bit.ly, and then it's Spirea 101.
And I think Gail just put that in the chat.
Link. And I sent that to Gail so she could put it in the chat if she wanted.
Yeah.
It's a fun little background on Spirea. It talks about the different Spirea types. I'm a big cheerleader for Spirea because it's so easy to grow. You know, Georgia talked a little bit about, possible diseases, but it's so seldom, right? That's why you see it in landscapes everywhere you go. It's bulletproof, it's easy to grow, and the payoff is huge with Spirea. So I just think, once you get a couple in your garden, you're going to start looking for more spaces to pop one in there, especially these nice tiny ones too.
I totally agree. Spirea is an easy shrub to grow, and a lot of consumers need easy shrubs to grow. Also, how many shrubs bloom all season long? Not very many. All these summer flowering Spirea give you color for a really long time, and I think that's something people should take into consideration. So I think it's a great group of plants. In the upper Midwest, I'm a Minnesota gal, they're really, really important in landscapes.
Yeah, and to echo that, not just flowers, but in foliage, the spring, summer, and fall, that's a huge period to have something going on in your landscape that whole time. And as people are more and more concerned about drought and pollinators and sort of this idea of being a part of the ecology around you, it's a great pollinator plant when you have flowers for that long, and pretty drought tolerant also. So that's a plus in my book.
Okay, so it looks like we do have one last question, and it might be a caution, but somebody is asking, how can you, and I'm going to say, should you, propagate a cutting from your neighbor?
That is an interesting question to ask people that work for brands, because here's the thing. Is anytime we come up with one of these amazing Spireas that you saw today in this presentation, there's been a lot of investment in that plant, all the way from the breeding to the selection. It takes up to 10 years to introduce a new plant. So there's a huge trialing process that goes into any, I'm sure all of our companies have this very long trialing process to make sure that the plant that we're bringing to the garden center performs better than the black container Spirea that you're going to get in front of somebody's yard when you're driving down the road. So for that reason, we don't encourage you to propagate at home. We want you to buy a new full-sized plant. It's going to take a long time for a plant that's this big to become something that's worthwhile in your garden. Buy a new full-size plant. It supports our breeders. That's their job. It supports the investment in research that we do toward these plants to make them better, to make them flower better, to make them non-invasive. All important things when it comes to gardening and supporting the garden industry. So I don't really have I can't really tell you how to propagate them, but I can tell you why it's important to make the investment in a full-size plant and support your local garden center at the same time.
Yeah, leave all the hard work up to the expert growers that are out there, because like you say, it's going to take a long time to get a cutting into something that you really want in your yard. So any other closing thoughts from Natalie or Debbie or Georgia? I think this has been a wonderful webinar. You want to speak up with your last closing thought before we all go out and buy our new Spirea?
No, just saying thank you all for joining us. And thank you, as always, Diane, for hosting. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you to all three of you. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. But yes, great information from all of you. Love the enthusiasm for all these varieties. It's great. We can have the big bridal wreath types and the smaller compact types for in the landscape, in containers, definitely something for everyone. So with that, I will say, go celebrate the year of the Spirea, celebrate this little, the little shrub that could, which is wonderful for all of us who are not expert gardeners. And with that, thank you everybody and have a great day.